Hello and welcome to SAS Bootcamp Week 5, Video 1. In this week, we are going to be changing things up quite a good bit here. We are actually moving into a little more advanced SAS content starting this week. So let me first go over our agenda, talk about what topics we are going to cover, and then we'll go into a little bit of introduction in PROC SQL for this specific video. Right? So all of this week, the only thing we are going to cover is PROC SQL. That's the only topic on the agenda. Within PROC SQL, we are going to talk about the structure of PROC SQL, which is shown right here with the select, from, where, group by, having, and auto by statements. We'll talk about differences between data steps and PROC SQLs and when to use which one. And then we are going to talk about create tables, group bys, and merging data sets. So if you've been following along for the past 4 weeks, you will recognize that many of these topics, you've already learned these things, right? These are things that we've already covered in the previous weeks using data steps. In fact, I will tell you that if you followed along with the bootcamp thus far, you've already learned enough material in SAS to be able to go work on your own health outcomes research projects, right? You should know enough to go do health services research in SAS already. In fact, PROC SQL is an advanced topic. It's actually not required knowledge to get base SAS certification. If you want advanced SAS certification, you'll have to learn PROC SQL. So we are actually getting into a little more advanced coding here. The reason we are doing this is because even though PROC SQL is considered advanced, I think it is not very difficult to learn, and it makes your programming so much easier in some places. And we'll talk about how that is, right? But PROC SQL is one of those really nifty little tools to have in your SAS toolbox when you work on these programs. So let me begin by talking about what PROC SQL actually is. And we will talk about how to employ it within health outcomes research. Okay, so here we go. This week, unlike previous weeks, I'm going to be working off a code file that has already been written. I'm hoping this saves me some time of typing into the code file. And it also hopefully will help make the video shorter so you don't have to watch videos for as long. Anyway, so let me talk about SQL. SQL, which actually stands for Structured Query Language, is a programming language that was created back in the 70s, and it was super popular for basically retrieving tables and doing certain things. If you've had any programming experience outside of SAS before you took this bootcamp, whether that was in R, whether that was in Python, Java, you've probably encountered SQL, as it is often called, in one way or another, right? SQL or SQL language is really, really popular, and it is incorporated into almost every single platform out there. So if you've already learned SQL, you'll find that it is familiar to what you're going to learn in SAS today. If you have not learned SQL before, whatever you're learning now can be applied with slight tweaks across several programming platforms. Within SAS, SQL is incorporated through PROC SQL, which is what we are going to learn today. So let's first talk about some of the differences between PROC SQL and data steps, right? Because everything that we've done so far, we've done using data steps. Besides simple things like sorting a data set, for example, where we use a PROC sort procedure. But most everything was done in data steps. We are going to talk about how to do those same exact things in PROC SQL. So what is the difference? Why would you want to learn PROC SQL when you can already do things like creating variables, adding rows, merging data sets? If you can do them through data steps, why are we doing them through PROC SQL? Well, for one, PROC SQL makes those steps a lot easier, right? But fundamentally, PROC SQL works differently from SAS. PROC SQL is like that part of SAS that was weirdly added on later because it works nothing like the rest of SAS. Let me give you an example. So when talking about how data steps work in SAS, we talked about the program data vector. We talked about how the program data vector, which is basically a short name for the memory on your computer, executes your data steps line after line after line, right? So when you write a data step with data, set, and run statements, every single line in between those set and run statements is executed one after the other. And the way the program data vector works is it actually reads the data set one row after another, right? You read the first row, it executes the code. The second row, it executes the code, and it goes so on and so forth. And it goes step by step. So the way the program data works is that the program data vector, it inputs one row of the data set into your computer's memory, performs the code, churns it out into the output data, then loads the second row into the computer's memory, and so on and so forth. In SQL, that does not happen. That process gets thrown out the window. The program data vector does not function in the way that we understand it. Instead, what happens is that PROC SQL, once you've written or submitted a PROC SQL command, SAS reads all of your PROC SQL code at once. It doesn't go line by line as it would do in a data step, and it does not read the data set row after row either. So it first reads all of your code, right? And then it digests the information you're telling it. So if you are giving it a set of commands, SAS will understand and digest the commands you're giving it, and then it will approach the data set. And then instead of going row by row into the data set, it actually reads the entire data set into your computer's memory. It doesn't read the first row into the memory and then perform it, or the second row and then perform the functions. It reads the entire data set into the memory. So it uses up a little more working memory while doing this, but it gives you huge advantages in the process. So if you remember, one of the things we learned a couple of weeks ago was SAS's program data vector in a data step cannot read across rows, right? If it is in one row, it only reads the information that's in that row. And if you want to read across rows, you might have to use the lag function, the retain function, first dot and last dot functions. Well, with PROC SQL, the whole data set is uploaded into the working memory at once, not just row after row. And if the whole data set is in the working memory, reading across rows becomes simple. You don't have to use functions like lag and retain and first and last dot. PROC SQL can handle all of that within regular processing. That it's so much more easier. So PROC SQL is better at doing certain things. The problem with PROC SQL, though, the disadvantage is that it's actually harder to debug. If you write PROC SQL and you find that something in your code is not working, syntax errors are less likely, which means there will be errors in your output from the code, but log might not show you that there is an error, number one. And number two, when you do identify there is an error, debugging it actually becomes harder. Because in a SAS data step, you can go line by line and debug what is happening, because that's how the computer executes it. It's easier to debug code in a data step. But in PROC SQL, you can't just go line by line. You have to digest all of the SQL step together in one command, if you will. And that makes debugging for us a lot harder as well. The other thing about PROC SQL that is a disadvantage is that it actually can take longer processing times. For one, we've already seen that it takes more memory, but on the other hand, PROC SQL is very efficient, actually more efficient than data sets when working with really small data sets, because it can digest the whole data set at once and take care of it in one swoop, right? But when you work with big data that like the data that you probably be working with if you're working with health outcomes research with Medicare or Medicaid administrative claims data, we are working with millions and millions of rows. When you work with data sets that big, PROC SQL actually slows down processing. In fact, I know of firms and companies which use large data sets to do health outcomes research that strongly discourage using PROC SQL because it slows down their whole server and slows down any operations done on the server. So PROC SQL is useful, it is advantageous, it makes your coding simpler, but PROC SQL does have some disadvantages. I've seen that a lot of programmers either swing strongly one way or the other, which is some programmers use nothing but data steps, some programmers use nothing but PROC SQLs. I don't like either of those camps. I like to walk the middle ground. I'll use data steps wherever I can, and wherever things get easier, I will switch over and use a PROC SQL instead. So you have to understand which one is better for you in which context and use them appropriately. And I would strongly discourage you from becoming a purely PROC SQL programmer. If you want to be a purely data step programmer, I think there is no harm in it. It might take a little more time to program some things, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. But programming purely in PROC SQL can make proofreading your code or transferring your code much more difficult, so I would urge some caution in that. All right, that's the introduction for PROC SQL. Let's go talk some more detail about what PROC SQL actually looks like. Right? So PROC SQL actually has a structure. Every time you write PROC SQL, you have to begin with the words PROC SQL, P-R-O-C SQL, semicolon, and you have to end your PROC SQL with a quit statement, not a run statement like we've been seeing with every other data step so far. Instead, PROC SQL ends with a quit. So it's a PROC SQL and a quit, and in between the PROC SQL statement and the quit statement, you have to write sentences with this structure, right? So the structure is select, from, where, group by, having, and order by. and that is necessarily the order. You can't move the order up and down. You have to write it in that order. You can skip some of these things if you want, as I'll show you, but you have to write them in that exact order. The way to remember it using a mnemonic is to say, so few workers go home on time. Right? S, which is so, stands for select. F, few, stands for from. W in workers stands for where, and then group by, and so on and so forth, as you can see on the screen here. That mnemonic is very useful. I still find myself repeating the mnemonic in my head when I need to do PROC SQL. But once you get used to it, some of these things will come very quickly to you. So let's skip all this talk and jump straight into it, and we can see what PROC SQL looks like if you start programming. For the bulk of this week's videos, we are going to be using 3 data sets. Let me introduce you to these data sets first. So we are going to be using, let me see. I think I need to upload my files here. Give me a second. Okay. I had to upload my files into the class library. I thought I did that earlier. Did not work. Okay. So let's go back. So for the bulk of this week's videos, we are going to be using 3 different files. The Benny date of birth, Benny DOB file, which contains 5 individuals and their date of births. We also have a file for gender, Benny ID and gender for 5 individuals. And then the Benny visit file, which is actually the same file we used last week during the week's videos, which shows the dates of office visit for these individuals. So having introduced you to these files, let me quickly go back to the code. So the base code for PROC SQL, the absolute basic utilization, you have to have 2 statements within PROC SQL. Between the PROC SQL and the squid, you have to have 2 statements, which is the select statement and the from statement. The select statement tells SAS what variables you are interested in, and the from statement tells SAS what data set it needs to pull those variables from. So in the from statement, the data set name, you are already familiar with this format. You write the lib name, a period followed by the data set name. In the select statement, you list out all the variables you are interested in, separated by a comma. Now don't let that throw you off, because in data steps, anytime you have to list multiple variables, you just separate them by a space. Think about a proc sort with a by statement, or a by statement in a data step. You just separate the variables with a space, you don't use a comma. But within PROC SQL, you have to separate your variables with a comma. The other important thing to notice here is that in a PROC SQL statement, you do not use semicolons until after all the statements are written. So you write your select statement and your from statement, then you have your semicolon followed by a quit, which means that select and from are actually one statement. I've just displayed them in 2 lines here. You can write them like this, for example, and it would work just the same. I like showing it this way because it helps me think through the process. So let me run this and let's look at what SAS will do when you just tell it to select 2 variables from a data set. So here's my log, and here are the results. So what that statement basically said is it told SAS that you have to go to this data set, pull these 2 variables, and then display them to me as output. So this is similar to what we usually use in a data step called the proc print procedure. And it basically does the same thing. It prints out the variables that you've requested and it puts them in your result statement. Now remember, this is not an output data set. This is in your results. This is an output from working on this procedure, if you will. So that's the basic PROC SQL. You can never execute PROC SQL if you don't have at least select and from clauses in your statement. Those are the 2 minimum ones. But let's go on and add more of them, right? We've seen the first 2, select and from. Let's see how the where statement looks like. And then I can go and add the other ones later in this week's videos as well. So the where statement in PROC SQL is similar to the where statement in the data step. So you still have your select statement, you still have your from statement, right? And in select statement, you list the variables you're interested in. In the from statement, you list the data set you're interested in. And then in the where statement, you actually follow that up with the condition that you need your data set to be filtered by. Once you enter a condition there, only the rows on the data set that meet that condition are actually outputted into your final data set. Otherwise, those rows are just deleted. The one other thing that I've added in this PROC SQL statement that is going to be new is the distinct command. The distinct command is basically a way to deduplicate a data set. So if you tell PROC SQL to output variables with the distinct command, what it will do is if a row is ever duplicated, then it basically removes the duplicates and only holds on to unique rows. Remember, it will check for uniqueness of the row based on the variables you list. So for example, if there are two people with different Benny IDs, but the same date of birth, then using the distinct statement on the date of birth alone will give you one date of birth. But if you use the distinct statement on Benny ID, comma date of birth, it will give you two rows, right? It's looking for unique combinations of all the variables listed in that select statement. In our particular example, the date of birth file actually does not have any duplicates, so it's not going to make any difference at all. But it is a really effective command to use when you are worried about duplicates in your data set. Okay, so this where statement here, basically, what it did is it took the Benny underscore DOB data set, and if you look here, there is actually only one individual in this data set that was born after January 1st, 1990. So when we added the where statement, it basically only output one row, Benny 2, whose date of birth was 10th April 1990. So hopefully that part should be really simple. Next, we are going to take a little more jump and we are going to say, how do you get PROC SQL to not just output these rows and these columns, but actually create a new data set? Well, the answer is really simple. You take your select, from, and where clauses, and on top of that, you just add a create table clause. The create table clause basically says, take whatever is being output out of the following statements with the select and the from and the where, and then put them into a SAS dataset. Instead of just outputting them into the default HTML output format, which we can't use that much. Right? The default HTML output format is when you need to visualize results. You can use it to do data management or data verification sometimes, but outputting things into HTML is not super useful in data management. We usually want to output things into a new data set, which you can do using the create table class. The create table class works similar to the data statement in a data step, where you tell SAS what is the name of the new data set you want to create. You follow it up with the words as or as, and then you select from and where clauses, just as we discussed before. The one new thing in this PROC SQL that I've written is I've used the splat operator. Instead of listing the names of every single variable, you can use a splat operator. Splat is a programming term. You can call it asterisk if you want. It's the same thing. I just typed the asterisk from my keyboard. The asterisk basically tells SAS that you want all of the variables in this data set. If you don't want all the variables and you are only interested in a few variables, you can list the names of those variables as you want it, right? But if you want every single one, then you don't have, and you don't want to type every single name out there, just use the splat operator, right? So let's run this, and then we'll talk about one more thing in the select command to wrap up this video. Okay, so my log looks good. Now I have nothing in the results tab, but in the output data tab, I actually have a data set now, and I can go look at the data set in my work library. If I open new underscore DOB, I'll see that's that one individual that was born after 1990, one row of data, two columns, that's in my output data set. So we managed to get PROC SQL to not just select certain variables from a data set, but actually filter and create it into a new variable, right? So this includes, right now, just with these 4 lines of code, we've talked about how to delete columns because we can identify if we want all the columns or only a few columns. We've talked about filtering or deleting rows using the where statement, right? Within the where statement, you just write whatever condition you want, and that helps filter or subset your data. and we've talked about creating a new table or a new data set. The one other thing I want to mention before we wrap this video up is that select clause. Right? That select clause with the distinct or without the distinct operator is actually really powerful. When you list variables in that select clause, the output data set actually displays variables in the same order as you are listing them. So if I list here Benny ID, DOB, that's the order in which the variables will be listed. If I instead list DOB, Benny ID, which is if I want to see the date of birth, if I want to see the date of birth first, okay, my window got messed up. If I want to see the date of birth first and the beneficiary ID second, I can do that. I can change the ordering of the variables. Like you see right here, now I have the DOB first, simply by changing the order of the variables within my select statement. Previously, when we were working with data steps, that was not something we could do, right? There are actually ways to change the order of the data set within data steps, but we didn't go that far because it was not necessary. So if you want to reorder your columns because you don't like which column comes before which one, use a PROC SQL and you can list them in the order you want within the select statement. So that's going to be it for this video. In the next video, we're going to talk about creating tables with more nuances, and we're going to talk about manipulating variables as well.